Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. But today we're taking a slightly different look at things. If you think about it, the war between Russia and Ukraine has dominated the news for quite some time, and it was slowly relegated to the old news section until more recently when Donald Trump got more involved. But Simon, I know you wrote an insightful column in the New Daily explaining some aspects of the war, things I hadn't thought about, the demographic statistics that may help us understand what's really going on over there. And Vladimir Putin's game seems to make a bit more sense to me now that you've explained it, Simon.
Yeah, so when this first happened, the invasion of Ukraine, I was very much concerned about the demographic storyline. I was like, is there a demographic angle?
Of course you would. You're a demographer.
That's what I do all day, every day. And I'm not going to say anything like, oh, this is solely a demographic narrative here. But the demographics are quite revealing. And if I were Vladimir Putin's personal war advisor, I would have probably told him right now is a pretty good time in history if you want to take over Ukraine. Or a couple of surrounding countries as well.
Why would you say that, Simon?
Because there is a relatively small demographic window where you do have enough manpower as Russia to take on some sort of geopolitical adventure, if you will, especially knowing that the Russian war tactics in history, and as we've seen today in the Ukraine war very much as well, very much rely on a meat grinder tactic, throwing many people into the war machine because the technology isn't as advanced as it could be, and so you just churn and burn your population. And we'll be dealing into the intricate details here a bit more in just a second.
Well, Simon, I thought the war, I don't know much about these things, but when it first came, I thought the war would be over pretty quickly. I assumed Russia was a superpower, had lots of money and had lots of military arms behind it. I guess that's the picture they wanted to portray. But let's start talk maybe about money in the Russian economy. How does that sit compared to other parts of the world?
Yeah, so, well, if we look at the military spending, we always talk about the 2% of GDP ratio. That's what NATO members are meant to spend on GDP. So it's a good starting point. Australia is just above that, 2.1%, and the Russians spend more than twice that. 4.3%. Now, of course, it's a war economy, now much more. But the idea is they always prepared for this. So you'd be excused, Michael, to think that the Russians had this in the bag, but that's very much not the case. And because turns out that even though you take into account what money buys you in Russia, because there's much lower labor costs than compared to the US or Australia, so you can actually get more shells and military equipment out of each dollar that you spend, in theory at least. Yeah, and we now might even doubt the impressive cyber capabilities of the Russians because they always were talked up a lot as well. And now that we've seen the dismal performance on the battlefield, some people put even that into question. How good is the cyber warfare capabilities of the Russians? So all of a sudden that was quite disheartening from a Russian perspective, that all the money that you throw into your military did not give you the results. And that also points to a problem of systemic corruption, which will surprise exactly no one. But a lot of money that was meant for the military appears to have gone to alternative sources.
Well, reading your article, and I'll put a link to it in the New Daily, I was surprised to read that Russia produces about the same economic output as Australia, if you talk about GDP, despite having, 6 times the population?
Exactly. It's staggering that you have close to 150 million people and you produce just as much wealth as Australia. This is dismal. So if you then break this down to GDP per capita, it's 6 times the difference. It's 6 times less. So Russian GDP per capita is about 10,000 US and it's about 60,000 US in Australia. It's quite disheartening. And you see that for many Russians, since there is no economy worth speaking of other than a bit of extraction of oil essentially and gas and a bit of agriculture, there's nothing Russia literally got nothing. It is a god-awful joke of an economy, and the little wealth that is created is not distributed even remotely fairly in the country. So probably many Russians, young Russians, are the winners of the economy if they were the few relatively educated folks that immediately fled the country as soon as the war started because they knew of the meat grinder tactics and they just left it. Apparently about 1 million Russians, relatively young Russians, around Georgia, Azerbaijan and so forth, they just buggered off. And it's the right move. As a young Russian, leave the country and never come back. It's the only smart choice, in my humble opinion.
A lot of poor countries do well with their economy based on tourism. I guess Russia doesn't have that luxury either anymore.
No, they didn't. The Russian tourism figures never were impressive. And then there was urban tourism because you have lots of beautiful dwellings and museums in St. Petersburg, in Moscow. But why would you go there now? This is stay away from it. You might still have a couple of former Soviet satellite states that still send a bit of tourists there, but it is, for all intents and purposes, tourism is dead.
So in context then, Russia's economy is not doing particularly well and it's been going downhill. So I guess the Russian, well, I was about to call him a dictator. I guess he's a president for life, has to do something. Is that what's behind all this?
Partly this is behind this. So if an economy is tanking, you get short-term survival, short-term benefits from turning it into a war economy. So you could argue that there is an economic storyline behind this, but usually people like Putin actually tell you what they think and what they care about. Vladimir Putin famously said that the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. And he desperately wants to get the band back together. He wants to make sure that Russia can plug all its perceived security gaps. And that means you do need to take over quite a few countries. So this means that Ukraine always was just meant to be the first step in a line of moves. And turned out that this was much harder than expected, which leads to all different geopolitical assumptions. George Friedman, for example, the founder of Geopolitical Futures, very much is of the opinion that Russia just proved to the world that is not a superpower. Because he argues, if you are a superpower, you better be able to take on a small country like Ukraine in no time. Russia showed impressively that it can't and therefore must be disregarded as a superpower, which puts in question all the issues about, well, why do we have a NATO? The NATO is meant to contain the Russian threat. And so if there's no Russian threat, you can take NATO away. And that then opens up a discussion about how do you treat Russia. And in the past, the US has always built up their former enemies. Germany, major enemy, was defeated and was built up, turned into an ally. Vietnam, defeated, up for discussion, turned into an ally. Japan, they nuked cities in Japan and all of a sudden they turned it into a very, very strong ally, very strong bipartisan relations. And they go, well, now that Russia really can't be seen as a threat anymore, we need to turn Russia into an ally and build it up. This would be done with Vladimir Putin in power because taking Vladimir Putin out would create geopolitical uncertainties, which is what they wouldn't want. And that, of course, flies in the face of the Europeans, who very much think of Russia still as an active threat and who would not want this. So there's the geopolitical movements all there that were absolutely unexpected 3 years ago when we thought that Russia was a superpower. And we want to put ourselves back into Vladimir Putin's shoes 3 years ago when he decides to take on Ukraine. First and foremost, I think we must start with Vladimir Putin himself. So you're turning 70. You pretty much know that you have the position in power forever, but you also know that time is running out. So your main goal is you're viewing yourself as Catherine the Great, as a big leader who wants to take on countries, who wants to increase the reach of the Russian Empire. Your time is now. You know that you're not getting any younger. So you give yourself a window of maybe 10, 20 years. And within these 10, 20 years that you have to deal with now, meaning 2021, 2022, that is the perfect time in history to be doing this. Because what did Vladimir Putin manage to achieve? Well, he took over Russia in 1999 with super low birth rates. And the healthy thing from his perspective is that he took on Russia at a time when life expectancy was outrageously low. Russian men died in their early to mid-50s.
Wow.
And largely induced from alcohol. You died early on because you drank yourself to death with home distilled, very dangerous vodka. And so what this means is that in 1999, there were no old men. There were no old women to take, particularly no old men to take care of. So you had relatively low medical costs and care costs associated. It was actually a benefit, so to speak, from his perspective. And you had low birth rates, hyper low birth rates. And he did manage to increase birth rates from 1999 onwards. It led to a mini baby boom, which now means it didn't go above replacement rates of 2.1 women, but you did get birth rates up. And this means you now have a cadre of military-aged men to deal with, because it was just a little spike, and then it fell down again. And now you have this spike of 18 to 27-year-olds, which is the military conscription age in Russia. And so if you know you have a churn and burn war ahead of you, this is the time. It's a 10-year window. You got to do it now. This was always going to happen now, if it was ever going to happen. So that's a helpful thing in mind, that, you know, for the next 10 years, you have an increasing pool of military-aged people. And after these 10 or 12 years, it is absolutely going to plummet down. And then your window of opportunity is gone. Your window of opportunity from Putin's perspective is gone anyways, because you are by then 82, 85, which is not the right time to be venturing out again and again, because he knows that he will not live forever. But so that's the basic crux of figuring out what to do, because the ultimate numbers, when we talk about Russian population is declining, we don't care about this. The total population is not what Putin is on about. It is the military-aged male population. So we must dive deeper into the demographic opportunity, if you will, from a war perspective. It always sounds hyper cynical if we even allow ourselves to talk this way, but I'm sure that this at least played some role in Putin's thinking, because he is famously obsessed with birth rates, obsessed with increasing the Russian population base. And one option, of course, is to take on more countries. If you all of a sudden turn on all Ukrainians into Russians again, then you have more young men to burn for the next adventure.
Well, I love the way you swung things around to demographics. So for new people watching us for the first time or listening for the first time, this is not a political weekly show at all. It's really more about understanding demographics, particularly in Australia, about where business people, entrepreneurs, investors, governments, institutions should focus their attention. But I do like that today we're actually doing it about some other things as well. And so there obviously is some demographics behind the timing of this. You're explaining to me that Russia didn't have the older aging population a lot of other countries did. It also had some policies like the Mother and Child program that influenced the demographics in Russia. How do you see this impacting of the lack of aging population, not an old population in Russia, affecting its long-term economic and, I guess, military strategies?
Well, in the short term, it's a plus, because you know that your population, you don't need to look after old people. It is, of course, an absolute catastrophe for the health of the country that you just willingly allow your population to die young, which is, it's just ethically the wildest thing. And there's a long history in Russia in doing this. A wonderful book called Vodka Politics, which is totally worth a read for anyone wanting to read about Russia. How alcohol, vodka in particular, has long been used in Russia as a tax source. Russia doesn't have much to tax its people, but you essentially create a population that is addicted to alcohol that you control. You sell it, you tax it highly. It's a way of keeping control, because you hand it out in small bars in local areas where you have full taps on the population. population. It's always famously Stalin used vodka to keep its people, the cadre around him, honest, to make sure that they're constantly drunk and spoke the truth. And the idea was that you have a people that are inebriated so that they couldn't actually plot against you, because in vino veritas, alcohol makes you speak the truth, so to speak. It's an hilariously brutal and cynical book, but well worth the read. And so the takeaway is, demographically speaking, a benefit, so to speak, because you don't need to have medical costs at the moment. The life expectancy did increase a bit after the fall of the Soviet Union because of beer, imported beer. People were still alcoholics, quite dramatically, but it is much harder to drink yourself to death with beer compared to vodka. So that did increase life expectancy, which is a bizarre niche demographic development where beer actually saves lives.
Is there a gender gap in this, Simon? In other words, were women drinking as much as men?
So Russian women drink more compared to other women outside of Russia, but the gender gap is gigantic. So it is very much a male phenomenon. There was a life expectancy gap of decades between men and women. And usually you'd have, like, in Australia, it's 4 years, which is about as high as it should be. It's brutal. And there is no way out, if that makes sense. And so if you know that your population keeps dying in your face, you're still economically productive for 10 years. So even the economic argument needs to be taken with a grain of salt. This is a high cost. And of course, it's a country that disrespects or devalues life so much is cynical beyond belief.
So looking at these demographic trends, then what long-term challenges should Russia prepare for?
Well, you have the aging now. Now that life expectancy ticks upwards and you have super low birth rates, the aging is guaranteed to worsen. So you have all of a sudden a couple more people to look after. You have a shrinking workforce. Russia isn't the migrant destination that, for example, Australia is. We also have the problem here. Aging population, not enough babies, but we throw migrants into the mix so we can slow down the aging process. Of course, we discussed this many times. Migration brings certain kind of challenges with it as well, but demographically speaking, it is a solution. That solution is not an option in Russia. Yes, there are about 10, 11 million migrants in Russia at the moment, but these are people from former Soviet satellites, and they make up 8% of the population. Here, migrants make up a third of the population. So it gets nowhere near this. And now that we've seen migrants from former Soviet states being forcefully conscripted into the Russian army, you can bet your bottom dollar that the migration intake to Russia slows down. So even the little bit of migrant intake that they have is now worsening. So demographically speaking, Russia is an absolute catastrophe. This is a people that are going to die out. To not be too dramatic, but this is the kind of length that we're talking about. And if you are convinced, as Putin, that the Russian people must live on, well, what do? You do anything you can to increase birth rates. You want to take on Russians by force. You want to take on Ukrainians because before the invasion, for the last couple of years before that, you as Putin published heaps of works that actually made a intellectual argument that Ukrainians are Russians. And that's the idea. So you want to stop your people from dying. So you have your ethnic power base. And he then created this argument. It's very old-fashioned. This argument wouldn't fly anywhere in the Western world. But so you have, yes, these are my people. This is my ethnic tribe, done. And so you bring home the Ukrainians to the motherland. It turns out that you now have strengthened Ukrainian nationalism to a maximum. These Ukrainians that are alive today will never see themselves as Russians, even though some might have in the past. That's gone now. So he shot himself in the foot there. If you see all the other countries that are next on the list to take over, the Baltic states, Poland even, theoretically, they hate Russia vehemently. So the future for the Russian people, so to speak, is very, very bleak. And if Putin was a realpolitik leader, he would probably know that peace, friendship with the US, becoming a vassal state of the US, a buffer state between China and the Western world, is his best bet of making his people survive. Again, we're talking about very cynical views, and this is not stuff that works anywhere in the favor of the Russian people themselves. But I think this is at least somewhere on the discussion table, the realpolitik view here.
Well, this show has been recorded. We recorded this probably a couple couple of weeks before it goes live. And this is a fluid market at the moment with Russia, Ukraine and America and the politics. So even between now and when people are watching this and listening to this, things could change considerably. Let's see how it all plays out. But in the meantime, it's really interesting to go just back a step or go a little bit deeper and understand what may have been in his mind and why the timing of it was critical. So that's very valuable. So I guess as a demographer, you would have advised him on this. That's not your job to advise the Russian politicians, but I know you advise local governments, politicians, organisations, institutions, businesses. So maybe you could just quickly explain what you do in your role as the co-founder of the demographics group, and if people want to get this sort of insight for themselves, how they can do that.
Yeah, well, the business model is pretty much what we've done here is we look at any kind of topic, any kind of business, any kind of region, and we look at this business, this industry from the demographic perspective. There's always a demographic angle to absolutely anything, and this is what we're trying to understand.
Why does it not surprise me that you say that?
Yeah, it is a self-serving narrative, isn't it?
So there is a demographic angle, and if people do want to understand how to use demographics to grow their business, teach their staff, train their staff, understand why different people have different views, then I'll leave a link in the show notes to get in contact with Simon at the Demographics Group and see how he could help you. Now, we've done a great series of podcasts and articles way back at the beginning of this year on the different demographic groups and how you could understand why baby boomers think differently, react differently, respond differently, need different stimulation to other generations. So why not go back to wherever you're watching or listening to this and have a listen to some of our previous podcasts? And if you got some benefit from this, please subscribe to Demographics Decoded wherever you're listening or watching this, so once a week you get our information. And if you have enjoyed it, and I know a lot of people are because the subscriber numbers are skyrocketing each month, please tell somebody else about it. Let them enjoy it as well. Simon, thanks a lot. Look forward to catching up with you next week. I'd actually like to ask you something about, or maybe I'll have a say too, did baby boomers really have it easier? Because one of the discussions a lot of people keep bringing up is property's unaffordable, it's not fair, you baby boomers took all the good properties. So that would be, I think, a good topic to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. Looking forward to a bit of baby boomer generational analytics.
Thank you. See you then. Bye. This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.